When the men of Apollo 11 got out of quarantine, Richard Nixon had them and a few hundred guests out to Los Angeles to celebrate. By all accounts, it was a heck of a party. Sometime well into the evening, one of the other astronauts in attendance, by now more than a little drunk, raised his glass. "Here's to the Apollo program," he said heartily. "It's all over." In a sense, he was right. John Kennedy's challenge to land a man on the moon and return him safely to the Earth, the goal that had steered NASA for 8 years, had been met. But was Apollo's mission completely over? Was the lunar landing simply an engineering demonstration like the first flight across the Atlantic? There were those who thought so, even some within NASA. Kennedy had said nothing about a second lunar landing, or even a third. You wouldn't ask Lindbergh to fly the Atlantic again, they said. Why go back to the moon? But in the summer of 1969, Apollo was only part of a much bigger question. The future of the space program as a whole was undecided. When Richard Nixon took office, the agency had tried to gain early support for a manned space station in Earth orbit. But the president deferred the matter by creating a space task group to formulate recommendations for NASA's future. By July, NASA Administrator Tom Paine was working with the STG on a plan that picked up where John Kennedy had left off. Paine, like his NASA colleagues, believed that there was something implicit in Kennedy's challenge, beyond its words, that it was a call for the United States to become a space-faring nation. Apollo had given the country the technology to go to other worlds. It had only to exploit that capability. At NASA headquarters, George Mueller and other planners had put together a far-reaching plan that Paine made even more ambitious in adapting it for the STG. The task group's timetable called for a 12-man space station and a reusable space shuttle as early as 1975, depending on funding. By 1980, the station would have grown into a 50-man space base. 5 years later, there would be 100 men in orbit. Meanwhile, there would be a base in lunar orbit by 1976, with a base on the lunar surface 2 years later. Then, as early as 1981, the first manned expedition to Mars would depart from Earth orbit. The plan was extraordinary, but it was not new. Almost 20 years earlier, the same basic scenario had been mapped out in the pages of Collier's magazine by Wernher von Braun and other space experts. At the time, von Braun was criticized for trying to sell the public a science fiction vision of the future. In the summer of 1969, Paine was trying to turn von Braun's vision into a reality. Like everyone at NASA, Paine hoped that the spectacular success of Apollo 11 would create a groundswell of support in the White House and in Congress to propel the space program onward and upward. Fortunately, Vice President Agnew, the chairman of the STG, was extremely enthusiastic, especially about the missions to Mars. The group's report would be ready for presentation to the White House in September. But already there were signs it would not be well received. Since 1965, the year Apollo funding reached its peak, NASA's budget had steadily declined. Nixon staffers had told the agency that this trend would continue and had indicated that even the first building block in the STG plan, the Earth Orbit Space Station, would be a tough sell. Meanwhile, Apollo moved on. Jim Webb had needed all his persuasive abilities to convince Congress and the Bureau of the Budget to pay for enough Saturn V's to fly missions through Apollo 20. He had done so on the premise that no one knew how many flights would be necessary to meet Kennedy's challenge. Now that the first lunar landing had been accomplished sooner than anyone had expected, there was enough hardware to fly 9 more lunar landings. Payne intended to make good on Webb's foresight. The handful of doubters aside, NASA had no intention of abandoning the moon. And if anyone wondered what would come from going back to the moon, they had only to be inside the windowless Lunar Receiving Laboratory at the Manned Spacecraft Center on the evening of July the 25th, 1969. In the LRL, 5 geologists, dressed all in white, hospital-style clothes and caps, stood around a vacuum chamber. A big, powerfully built technician reached into a pair of spacesuit arms attached to one side of the chamber to open a silvery container about the size and shape of a large tackle box. Inside, preserved in a lunar vacuum, were pieces of the moon. For the better part of a decade, geologists had labored to extend the disciplines of their science to an alien world by remote observation. What they had managed to learn about the moon from their telescopes and then the unmanned probes testified to the power of human intelligence. But they had always longed for the moment when they could look at the moon with their own state-of-the-art laboratory instruments, or simply with human eyes. After long moments of effort, the box was finally open. The technician removed a mesh covering and a strip of foil that was part of a scientific experiment, and set them aside. Then he stepped away from the chamber and let the scientists have the first look. With television carrying the event live, Harvard geologist Clifford Frondell peered into the chamber and blurted out, "Holy shit, it looks like a bunch of burnt potatoes." The rocks were so covered with charcoal-colored dust that the geologists couldn't tell anything about them. At this moment, the curiosity that gripped them was not scientific at all, but instead very human. These were actual pieces of the moon. 2 nights later, the first sample to be cleaned was raised up inside the chamber while Frondell and the other scientists watched. Instantly, they recognized it as a piece of basalt. Familiar minerals glinted under the chamber lights. In the days and months to come, the scientist would try to coax secrets of lunar history from the rocks and dust from the sea of tranquility. And this was just the beginning.